Marjorie Almancy, Director of Recruitment and Engagement at SVP. I'm really excited to have all of you. I'm excited to have Bruce. I will pass it along to Mark Argosh, who is our Executive Director. If you could just say something for a couple of moments so people know who Mark is.
Thanks, Marjorie. As she said, I'm Mark Argosh, Executive Director of Social Venture Partners, and welcome everybody to this call. We're very excited to hear from Bruce and learn more about the importance of the Connecticut Mirror and what he's trying to do to really bring independent journalism to all the public policy issues that we all care so much about. With that, I see Camille next on my screen. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Camille Guthrie. I am the Director of Operations for SVP. And I have been with SVP Connecticut since it was founded in 2013.
Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine Yang, and I am a project manager with SVP, and I work with a number of our nonprofit partners and our project teams. And let's see, I think Michael, I saw Michael here.
Yeah, exactly. Michael, you might still be on another call. So I'll take it from here. Thank you so much, guys. I thought it was just important for everybody to be able to meet our amazing SVP team. I've never been prouder to work with more incredible people doing amazing things. Social Venture Partners is now 225 partners and growing each and every day. If anybody's interested in hearing more about SVP, I'd be happy to set up a separate meeting with you afterwards. I'm really happy and excited to have our partners, Jill, Debbie Fields, and a whole host of others that are on the call. I see Michael. So I will pass it off to Michael quickly for you just to give a brief introduction, and then I'm going to introduce Bruce.
Hi, my name is Michael Van Leesten. I'm the Director of Stakeholder Engagement with Social Venture Partners.
Okay, thank you. So we have a whole number of amazing things going on at SVP, but one of the things that we do offer these Connect and Learns about on a monthly basis, which are just a way for us to get together as an organization and learn about a whole variety of topics that fall within our bandwidth. So with that, I'm excited to introduce you to Bruce Putterman. As publisher and CEO of the Connecticut Mirror, Bruce is responsible for the strategic direction of the organization, revenue generation, product innovation, reader engagement, and all business operations. Before joining the Connecticut Mirror in 2017, Bruce owned and operated the West Hartford-based consulting practice for 16 years, providing strategic planning and marketing services to more than 50 nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, public agencies, private equity firms, and other for-profit clients. His interest in journalism dates back to the college years when he worked in commercial radio and TV news. I'm guessing that's why Dick knows Bruce. Bruce served as an elected member of the West Hartford Board of Education from 2003 to 2015, including 3 years as chair of the board. He grew up in Stamford and has a Bachelor of Arts in History and an MBA in Marketing from Cornell. So with that, I'll pass it along to Bruce. The format is Bruce is going to talk for a while, and then we will open it up to Q&As at the end. So again, welcome everybody. We're really happy to have you. And with that, I'll pass it off to Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Marjorie. And thanks everybody. Mark, great to see you again. I think we had lunch at a delightful place in Westport just before COVID sent us all scrambling for our dining rooms and living rooms and family rooms to work. And I see several other folks on here that I know as well who are supporters. So thanks to all of you for joining in the work of the Connecticut Mirror. I'm going to share my screen and we'll try to do this as seamlessly as possible. There we go. And give me 1 second. Okay. So can you see my screen? Marjorie, if you just nod. Yep, okay, great, terrific. So what I'd like to cover today are, and it's kind of in sequential order of implication, is decline in journalism, particularly the decline of local journalism. We'll talk a little bit about the Connecticut media landscape, the emergence of local digital news like the Connecticut Mirror, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Connecticut Mirror as well. So within the conversation, there will be a number of critical questions that are kind of embedded in all of the components that we'll talk about. Question one is, why journalism? What's the value of journalism? What's the role of journalism in our state, in our communities, in our society? Why the Connecticut Mirror? Why was the Connecticut Mirror formed? What role does it play? What void does it fill? And why is it important that organizations like the Connecticut Mirror survive and are sustained? And why now? We are in a critical moment right now. There's a lot of fluidity, a lot of things happening in the media landscape in Connecticut alone, and we can talk a bit about that. So many people talk in terms of journalism being critical to a thriving democracy. I'm sure you've heard that many times. And of course, that begs the question, well, what exactly does that mean? In what ways is journalism critical to a thriving democracy? I think of it in terms of journalism promoting democracy literacy. Journalism helps people become better informed around some of the important components of a well-functioning democracy. It helps people, well, there's data that clearly shows that people who are well-informed participate in voting at higher rates. Obviously, journalism helps people assess who they should vote for at the ballot box. It helps people make a determination as to what party they should join when they are registering to vote, or whether they should join a party at all, or whether they should switch parties over the course of their lives. It helps, and maybe we think about these aspects of democracy literacy a little bit less frequently, but journalism helps people decide what issues to advocate for. All of you are engaged in issue advocacy. Presumably journalism had a large role in helping you make a decision, formulate a decision in terms of how to engage as an advocate or an activist. Journalism helps you decide what causes or what political candidates to support financially or otherwise by joining a campaign, for example. It helps you talk knowledgeably to elected officials to make more compelling cases for your point of view when you're talking to elected officials, or frankly, when you're just talking to your friends and family around the dinner table. And then of course, there's kind of the traditional role of journalism being critical to a functioning, thriving democracy because of its role, its vehicle, its importance in holding government accountable. And that, of course, is the reason that journalism is, as we've heard many times, the only profession that is actually cited by name in the Constitution. It's for that watchdog journalism role. So given the importance of journalism, why is there this dramatic contraction in legacy print newspapers, and what does that mean? Since the birth of the internet in the mid-90s, circulation of US printed newspapers has declined from 60 million in the mid-90s, roughly 25 years ago, to about 35 million today. 2,100 newspapers, about 25% of the total in 2004, 2,100 newspapers have closed in the last 17 years. 200 counties in the United States lack a newspaper. Now that's kind of hard for us in Connecticut to understand, where there are still 18 daily newspapers in our state. And we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about the distinction between a news desert and news poverty. But for now, as just kind of an indicator of the contraction in legacy newspapers, 200 counties in the country lack a newspaper, and half of US counties just have one newspaper.
Bruce, I'm sorry, this is Camille from SVP. we're just seeing the first slide as part of the presentation. The slides aren't advancing. I don't know if you're intending to advance slides or not.
Sorry. Yes, I am. Sorry.
If you put it on slide, slide show.
No, I'm actually in the...
We're seeing the presentation view, but the slides are not advancing.
Okay, hang on. Display settings. Is that any better?
Okay, now we're seeing the full screen, and we're on newspaper contraction. We're seeing that slide.
Great, terrific.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yep, sorry. So in any event, if I'm sorry if that was a distraction. The point being, there's a contraction. Many newspapers have closed, and of the survivors, many of them have significantly reduced their coverage. And I would argue that every newspaper in Connecticut, to one degree or another, has reduced their coverage from, you know, kind of the glory days of the 80s and prior. And on top of that, newspaper newsroom jobs have shrunk about 50% since 2008. So why has this contraction occurred? I think there are 4 reasons. First and foremost is the emergence of the internet. As you'll remember, in the mid-90s, when the internet was born, there was this great culture, this expectation of free content, and news kind of fell into that trap. And people were flocking to the internet for their news. And as a result, subscription revenue for legacy print newspapers began to plummet. Secondly, there has been an advertising bloodbath in legacy newspapers, particularly in local journalism. So as you probably know, advertising was kind of a high margin proposition for newspapers. They got a fair amount of their revenue from advertising, and nothing had a higher margin than classified ads. So Craigslist comes along shortly after the birth of the internet and essentially wipes out classified revenue from newspapers. Then as Google and Facebook develop and become powerful advertising platforms, they also begin to drain away lots of local, national and local advertising revenue. And so as an example of this decline in revenue, this chart shows, Camille, the chart advanced, right?
Yes.
Okay. So this chart shows the decline in newspaper advertising revenue since 2000, just shy of 50 billion then to about 15 billion now. And the increase in US newspaper revenue from online revenue has not come close to making up the decline over the last 20 years. And Facebook and Google in particular are taking a huge share of digital advertising spending. So, you know, newspapers, it isn't a simple proposition to migrate from print to digital pure newspaper, because first of all, newspapers aren't getting nearly as much in subscription fees from a digital product as they are from a physical printed product. And Facebook and Google are responsible or are generating a large percentage of digital advertising revenue. At the national level, Facebook and Google represent 58% of national advertising revenue. And at the local level, Google and Facebook represent 77% of advertising revenue. So that doesn't leave a lot of revenue for the legacy newspapers and the websites that they all run. Third reason for the contraction, I believe, is the corporatization of journalism. So, you know, back in the day, lots of newspapers were owned by individuals who had a commitment to community, were vested in their community, and even some of the newspaper chains were very community oriented and were largely immune from some of the other developments related to, you know, pressure for financial return and that sort of thing. And that changes a bit in the in the 80s and particularly in the 90s, where owners and small groups sell out to larger organizations who have much more of an earnings orientation than they do a community orientation. And that earnings organization leads to cost cutting and profit taking. And that to me explains part of the reason why legacy newspapers have shrunk considerably over the last 20 or so years. And then finally, there's the question of trust. And I think we've all read plenty about the erosion of trust, kind of as a reflection of the polarized political climate in which we live. To me, there's three components to trust. There's accuracy, or concern about accuracy of newspapers or journalism in general. There's concern about bias, and there's concern about lack of transparency. So I'm not going to talk about that today. We can talk about that at some other time, or we can talk about it a little bit in the Q&A. But for now, that's a fourth element contributing to the contraction. And I will just say this, that over the last 10 years, 4% of US adults have said that their trust in news media has increased. 26% say it hasn't changed, and 69% of US adults say their trust in US media or media in general has decreased. So that's a phenomenal number for an institution that used to be highly trusted. I suspect that that maybe is a little bit different at the local level than it is at the national level, for reasons related to, reporters live in the communities they report on, people know them, they see them at events or whatever. So out of all this emerges the concept of the local digital news organization. About 700 online-only local news sites have sprung up to fill this void that we've just been talking about over the last 10 years or so. And that's a combination of for-profit news organizations and nonprofit news organizations. And the only difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit is contributions to nonprofits are obviously tax deductible. Nonprofits can much more easily take foundation funding, and nonprofits don't pay taxes on revenue or on surplus, on profitability. And so any surplus at the end of the year goes back into the business as opposed to being paid to shareholders. These 700 online-only local news sites have been disproportionately clustered in cities and urban areas. The number of local independent news organizations has grown by about 50% in the last 5 years. So there's a clear emerging trend. But about 4 out of 5 of these digital local news organizations have fewer than 5 full-time employees. So while there's some emergence of local digital news as a response to the contraction in legacy news organizations, small, tiny digital news organizations don't barely begin to make up the difference that's left from the contraction. So there's 4 types of nonprofit news organizations. There's statewide nonprofit news, like the Connecticut Mirror, that covers states. The Texas Tribune is probably the best known and the most successful statewide nonprofit news organization. There are others. Cal Matters launched relatively recently, 4 or 5 years ago, and they are now a dominant statewide nonprofit news organization with a partnership with the New York Times, because my understanding is there are more New York Times readers in California than there are in New York. And there's a number of other states that have versions of the Connecticut Mirror. Vermont Digger, for anybody who gets up to Vermont, is a well-regarded statewide as well. There are city-focused nonprofit news organizations. One of the oldest ones is actually the New Haven Independent. And there are other well-known city organizations. Voice of San Diego is prominent. There are topic-specific news organizations. Probably the most well-known of those is the Marshall Project, which focuses on justice issues, named for Thurgood Marshall. But there are other topic organizations focusing on health. The Connecticut Health Investigative Team, CHIT, is an example of that. There are environmental nonprofits. There are food production nonprofits. There are nonprofit news organizations for a great variety of topics. And then finally, there are investigative nonprofits. ProPublica is probably the best example of that. Center for Investigative Reporting is another one. So back to this concept of news desert versus news poverty. News desert is a term that was coined to reflect a broad geographic area, a county, a cluster of counties for which there is no newspaper at all. No way of getting your news other than kind of local bloggers. News poverty, which probably is a better characterization of Connecticut, is plenty of news organizations, but reduced coverage, leaving gaps. So some of the gaps in coverage that have emerged over the last 10 or 15 years, even here in Connecticut, are coverage of the Capitol, coverage of Hartford, what is going on at that legislature, coverage of local government. There's not as much coverage of town council meetings, Board of Education meetings, zoning meetings, less coverage of our congressional delegation, a reduction in what we would call contextual or explanatory journalism. In-depth journalism or investigative reporting is another gap in coverage. And that's not to say that the local legacy newspapers don't do some of this. They do. They just don't do as much as they used to. And so just kind of quickly describing the Connecticut journalism landscape, it's robust in terms of number of players. It's robust in terms of quality of work. And it's particularly robust in terms of quality work for number of reporters left in news organizations. And those news organizations include 17 or 18 daily newspapers, ethnic news publications, weekly community newspapers, a number of hyperlocals, online only hyperlocals. Nancy on Norwalk is a good example. There's one in New Canaan, Wilton, Weston all have hyperlocals that I'm aware of. There's one trying to get born in Stratford, who I've spoken with. There's another public policy oriented news organization covering the Capitol called Connecticut News Junkie. CHIT I mentioned, there's 2 NPR radio networks. You all have WSHU down in your neck of the woods. Connecticut Public is based up here in Hartford. There are still 4 commercial radio stations left that do some type of news. There's 2 Spanish language radio stations with news. There are 2 business publications. The TV stations obviously do some level of news. There's an Associated Press presence here, although significantly hollowed out from what it used to be. And then think tanks and trade associations and groups like yours also publish what might be called journalism. So there's plenty of journalism, but we believe the voids remain. And that's what led to the founding of the Connecticut Mirror. Yes, there was a proverbial kitchen table. This isn't it. This is taken from some home magazine, but there was a proverbial kitchen table in Branford in 2009. And a couple down there who was interested in public policy issues convened a number of people, including a political reporter named Mark Pasniokis, who had been laid off from the Hartford Courant in kind of a massive layoff in 2009, which was kind of a harbinger of the contraction in legacy newspapers really taking root in Connecticut. They founded, this all occurred in 2009. The Connecticut Mirror first published in 2010. I joined in 2017, so I can't take any credit for the formation of the Connecticut Mirror. But I have been charged with trying to grow the Mirror as the rest of the industry continues to struggle, or much of the rest of the industry continues to struggle. Our mission is to inform Connecticut about public policy, hold government accountable, and amplify diverse voices and perspectives. In short, to promote and contribute to greater democracy literacy that we talked about at the beginning. We have, when I joined, there were 8 of us. I was the 8th person. We now have 14 full-time staff, 3 people on the business side, including me, and 11 journalists. I should point out, and Marjorie read this in the introduction, but publisher is the CEO role and also is the lead strategic role and runs all of the business operations. I don't get involved in day-to-day coverage. So if you have a quibble with or a concern or a suggestion related to our coverage, that would be directed to our executive editor, Beth Hamilton, and not necessarily to me, although I am practiced at forwarding emails to Beth. Our 11 journalists cover a number of beats. So we have, as many of you know, we have the most knowledgeable state budget reporter in the state, Keith Faniff. Mark Pasniok, I mentioned, he continues to be our political reporter. Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, as I'm sure some of you know, covers housing, which has been a big issue and is a big issue with the legislature this year. She covers housing and education. Historically, she was an education reporter. We have a justice reporter. We have a health reporter. We have a data journalist. We have a staff photographer. We actually have a second young education reporter who's helping out on education. We did have a Washington reporter. That position has been vacant for several months. And we also now have a gentleman named John Dankosky, who comes to us from Connecticut Public Radio, who runs our podcast. He runs our events. If you sat in on any of our virtual events, you would know John. And he also just brings a media leader's perspective to our organization. So the Mirror was formed around that kitchen table to fill the void in capital public policy press corps contraction. And to this day, we are essentially a public policy hybrid. During the legislative session, we will write what are called daily stories. So daily story is something that's written based off of an event or a press release or a press conference or some breaking news. So we write about legislative developments as they happen. During the legislative session, and particularly off session, we also write a lot of what are called, or focus on what are called, enterprise stories. And enterprise stories are not daily stories, they're stories, think of them as the stories that emerge or the ideas that emerge around a brainstorming meeting of what are some interesting topics that we should cover that are separate from kind of breaking news. They might be extensions of breaking news stories, the kind of the why and the how of breaking news stories. We're different in that we tend to stay in our lane. Our lane is public policy. We don't do things that are not related to public policy. Now, we do define public policy pretty broadly. It applies not only to government action, but it applies to covering institutions that take considerable amounts of government funding, or systems like the healthcare system that is driven largely by government funding. So healthcare system, UConn, businesses that take state funds for as grants or as loans. So all of that we would consider to be in the public policy realm. I think we're different in the sense that the traditional media, and this is an overgeneralization, but it's true directionally, I think. The traditional media focus largely, not exclusively, but largely on the kind of what, where, and when of events, and we try to focus more on the why and the how. And that's not to say that traditional media don't focus on the why and the how. They do sometimes. They just don't do as much as they used to, and there remains a void. And we are trying to fill that why and how void. And kind of as a quick example to illustrate this point, when Sandy Hook happened, one of our reporters said, well, to the editor, well, somebody should get down there. And there's this massive breaking news story right here in our state. And the editor said, okay, yes, you can go down there, but you're going down there to do reporting for the day 2 story, the why and the how story, not the what is happening in the moment story. And so we try to maintain that discipline in all of our work off session, when we're not in legislative session. Another way we're different is, like many traditional news organizations, we have an opinion page, but our opinion page is kind of statewide, so that people in Fairfield County can perhaps get perspective on from people and their experiences in northeastern Connecticut, which you don't really hear that much from. And similarly, people in other parts of the state can better understand the perspective from Fairfield County. And I feel relatively safe in saying this because I grew up in Fairfield County and still have family throughout Fairfield County. But Fairfield County and the rest of Connecticut seem disconnected from one another. So the more that we can share perspectives from around the state, perhaps the more of a sense of all being connected and belonging to the same state takes root. A couple of other quick things, and then I'll wrap it up and we'll go to Q&A. Our audience, when we first got started, the joke was that our audience was 06106. That's the zip code of the state capital. Policy wonks, elected officials, advocates, lobbyists, nonprofit business, and community leaders, and the occasional political junkie. Now, today, our audience has grown considerably to include all of those original audience members, but also just people who want to better understand what's going on in their state. We are a $1.7 million organization. When I joined a few years ago, we were roughly $1 million. So we are on a nice growth trajectory. I mentioned our nonprofit status before. And then in terms of revenue, people are surprised at this. Only 8% of our revenue comes from advertising. 88% of our revenue is contributed, 53% from individuals. So that's anybody from the $5 a month donor to a couple of annual six-figure donors. 35% of our revenue comes from foundations, and then 4% comes from content sales or content licensing. And what I mean by that is that if you read, the Connecticut Post or the Norwalk Hour, the Stamford Advocate, Greenwich Time, or Danbury News Times for that matter, you will occasionally see a story written by a reporter who's underneath it, in their byline, it says CT Mirror. So the Hearst papers and the Hartford Courant and several other newspapers publish our stories because they have a licensing agreement with us whereby they can publish our stories, and that makes up a small percentage of our revenue. So the question of how do we sustain journalism going forward is, I think, framed by this slide. If we agree that journalism is critical to a thriving democracy, to promoting democracy literacy, and if we agree that the market seems to have failed journalism, journalism by definition is a public good. The way arts institutions are a public good, or the environmental movement is a public good, or basic research is a public good, meaning that government and or members of community invest funding in these various areas because they are so critical to our community, to our country. And public goods are funded by government or individuals. We in the news business are always a little bit skittish about government money because it raises questions about editorial independence, although there are some interesting things going on, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, in which government might be able to help support journalism without compromising editorial independence, but that's a separate conversation. But the point being, if we believe journalism is critical to our democracy and to our communities, if we believe that the market has failed journalism, if we believe journalism is a public good, then it's up to all of us, we, the community, to support journalism. And then finally, our next opportunity. One coverage void we haven't talked about is economic development reporting. So in every election, gubernatorial election, presidential election, pollsters always ask people, what are the 3 most important topics that you'll be voting on this election? And the economy and jobs are invariably one of the top 3 responses that people provide. And yet we, and I would argue most of the other legacy newspapers in the state, don't really cover economic development. They have business reporters. We actually don't have a business reporter, but I see business as different from economic development. Business is writing about earnings, writing about C-suite moves, writing about product innovation, individual companies coming into the state or leaving the state. To us, to me, an economic development reporter focuses on much broader trends and on economic impact overall at the state level, about industry cluster formation and performance of different industries, of the financial services industry or the biotech industry or the defense industry. Economic development reporting would write about, in kind of an in-depth way, some of the pillars of a strong economy: transportation, other infrastructure, the business climate. Economic development reporter would write about state funding strategies overall related to business attraction and retention, and accountability for the use of state funding by those businesses that receive that funding. And then there's kind of, what are the constraints for advancing economic opportunity and economic development in the state, and what are the opportunities for advancing economic development and small business formation. The other void, I suppose, is that we don't really write about Fairfield County as much as we should. We still probably to this day are a little bit Hartford-centric, and one goal of ours is to focus more on Fairfield County, and economic development is an important vehicle for doing that, particularly since Fairfield County is an important economic development engine and is definitely the critical tax revenue engine for the state of Connecticut. And so what we are trying to do is we're mounting basically the equivalent of a capital campaign, and we're going to try to raise $300,000 for 3 years worth of an economic development reporter, and we're trying to raise that in gifts of $25,000, $10,000, and $5,000. And that's my presentation. Here's how you can get a hold of me, publisher at ctmirror.org. And I will stop sharing and happy to take any questions that anybody has. Marjorie or Camille, do you want to moderate, or because I can only see a handful of people?
Yeah, I think Marjorie is going to be moderating.
Marjorie, you're muted.
Bruce, can you see the chat? Some questions are coming in via chat.
Oh, okay, and I see
what diverse populations do you get voices and perspective from, and how?
I don't see that in the chat, but I will answer. So the diverse voices and perspectives that we seek are, I mean, frankly, that's at this point an aspirational goal more than it is something that we've been particularly successful at. We do, I would argue that a lot of what we focus on in our journalism has impact on diverse communities, but we don't yet have as broad, we don't source as broadly as we should. And we're actively trying to now build up an actual database of diverse sources so that our reporters, when they're under deadline, don't just go back to kind of people they're familiar with, but have a database that we're creating of diverse voices that they can talk to. But we have some work to do in terms of introducing ourselves in communities of color in particular, building trust in communities of color, and understanding what's working in communities of color and what's not working as well in communities of color. I will say this, during COVID, we wrote a lot about the inequities of that emerged in terms of testing, in terms of incidence rates of COVID, in terms of vaccinations. And as a result, we did become much better at talking to lots of people from lots of different perspectives. But I would argue that's a work in progress. So I do appreciate the question. It's good to have people remind us that that's a goal area.
So I'm sorry, before my mute wasn't unmuting. So everybody should be able to unmute themselves if they want to ask the question personally. I'm getting some questions through the chat, which I will ask, and I see some hands raised. So let me just go to the first question that's come up. This is from David Radcliffe. You and the Mirror Rock. Bruce, what are the implications of the possible buyout of the current for both news statewide and the opportunity or challenge this may raise for the Mirror?
All right, so full disclosure, my son is a reporter for the Hartford Courant. And so that aside, although that's an important element, you know, we wish a robust journalism ecosystem is critical, as you heard me say. Alden has a certain reputation. I can't really predict what they will do or not do if they purchase the Current. Seems like a relatively safe bet that they will replicate what they've done in other places, and people are nervous about the newsroom contracting even further. You know, and kind of profit taking and not investing back in the organization. What that means, Hearst, by the way, on the other hand, seems to be really beefing up their staff. You know, every week and as recently as yesterday, you know, they make another announcement about a relatively prominent journalist that they brought onto their staff. So down in your part of the state, you know, there seems to be some very positive momentum. But in terms of the challenges for us, I mean, from our perspective, there's plenty of journalism to go around. A healthy journalism ecosystem is good for all of us. So we look forward to them, you know, continuing to be partners with us, both as licensees of our content and ultimately as collaborators. I have a quote on my board here from Evan Smith, who's the publisher of the Texas Tribune, which says, "There are no competitors, just current and future collaborators." And that's how we view the journalism ecosystem.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yep.
From Angie Durrell, you can reach out to La Voz Hispana and Vivo con Mari Carmen. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. Also, In Tempo serves communities of colors in Stanford and Fairfield County. I believe media needs to reflect our shifting demographics and our economic impact.
Yeah. So we have a bit of a relationship with La Voz. We've encouraged all of the Spanish language news organizations to Spanish language or English language ethnic news organizations to publish our content for free. We make our content available to all nonprofits at no cost, and we do charge the for-profits, but we make it available at no cost to all of the ethnic publications in the state. But those are helpful in terms of In Tempo. We are aware of them, but we will put them on our list of people to reach out to.
Jane, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say Jane is raising her hand.
Yes, Jane, and then Rebecca, who I would love to have her introduce herself because she's also an SVP staff, and then she also has a question. So first we'll go to Jane, and then we'll go to Rebecca.
I don't have any credentials more than I work with the first organization that SVP got really into in Connecticut, Mark, which was CIRI, which is the Connecticut Institute of Immigrants and Refugees. Maybe the other way around. Bruce, I have spent 100% of my life in the nonprofit world, and I do not ever see the nonprofit world getting the credit that I think it should for so much of what happens in Connecticut or so much that happens in the world. You know, and I wonder what your take on it is in terms of economic development. We always see our needs and then think we should grow to meet them. And SVP has come into many of our organizations that people are representing today to try to help us be more businesslike, only to discover that we were businesslike, but just not aggressive and not taking advantage of what we should be doing. And I think they discovered a lot of other things too, and so did we. But I didn't hear one word about when you were discussing different clusters of industry that talked about the nonprofit world, which I know represents a very broad spectrum of services. But where does Connecticut Mirror come from in covering what's happening there or not?
You know, you're right. I mean, the nonprofit sector is an important component of economic development. We do cover the nonprofit sector, I would argue, a lot from the perspective of service delivery and the public policy leading that's connected to the funding of nonprofits to deliver services that the state otherwise would have to deliver. So we do write a fair amount. That is one sector, I guess I would argue, that we actually do write about. We just don't kind of position it as economic development, but you're right, Jane, it is an economic development story as well as a service delivery story.
Okay, thanks, Bruce.
Okay, so I can see the chat. Marjorie, if you want me to answer those directly, or did you want to introduce Rebecca?
Looks like Marjorie may be frozen. Yeah. So okay. Rebecca, why don't you ask your question? I see it in the chat also.
Okay, hi. So I'm Rebecca Fraser. I'm the new communications associate at SVP. And I'm just wondering, I didn't hear you mention the arts paper, which is a publication of the Greater New Haven Arts Council. And also I noticed the Connecticut Mirror does not have an arts section. So I'm wondering what, if any, role you see coverage of the arts playing in the creation of an equitable society.
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I didn't mention the arts paper. I guess I should have. There are no doubt some media that I am not familiar with, although I do know Daniel Fitzmaurice from the Arts Council in New Haven. He and I actually got together to try to birth an arts concept that we haven't quite gotten off the ground, but it's coming, I think, which is to encourage young artists, particularly young artists of color, to express themselves through art in our opinion section. We are trying to create some functionality to be able to take art and present it with integrity on our site. But in any event, in terms of arts reporting, there's as I said, there's a number of beats that there are still left for us to do that we haven't done. Economic development is the next highest priority for us. I also think that because the other news organizations in the state still to some degree cover the arts, it doesn't feel like quite the priority for us, especially relative to some other topics. We periodically have written about the arts. In fact, we have a podcast, a weekly podcast called Steady Habits. I alluded to it. And we did I think one of our best ones yet was on the impact of COVID on the arts. We did both a story and a podcast on that. And if you're interested in that, I can dig that up and send the link to Marjorie and she can forward it to you. But it was a nice piece. But yes, there's more of that to be done, both in terms of economic impact of the arts and in terms of the public policy aspects as well, because government does provide some funding for the arts, although significantly diminished relative to what it used to provide.
Bruce, Bob Welsh asks, after congratulating the Mirror on the many prestigious awards it's earned, beyond funding, what's the biggest challenge for the Connecticut Mirror today?
So scaling is the biggest challenge. We've grown tremendously in terms of number of people in the last couple of years. And I'm trying to figure out how to scale that up. we need, we used to be a small, as many of you know, when you're a small organization, you can kind of get by without systems, without processes. And as you grow, you need to either create for the first time or recreate systems and processes to be able to accommodate that scale. And that is a huge challenge. Journalistically, I would say that there are still, journalistically, we know that lots of people find us. We know that once people have kind of fallen in love with us, they support us, either sign up for our newsletter or or become donors, small donors or large donors. But it's that middle area that is kind of the next frontier for us. We get a lot of people to go out on first dates with us. And those of us who have gone out on many dates with us want to marry us, but it's getting people to go out on that second or third date that's the challenge. And we're actually very consciously kind of trying to address how to address that particular challenge now.
Okay. Mark Mathias asks a couple of questions. Given the changes happening in journalism, how do you measure success for journalism products? And secondly, what role do you see for alternate news comedy opinion providers, such as Stephen Colbert and John Oliver, that have been able to kind of reach very large audiences?
So in terms of success, and this is, the $64 million question. So there are quantitative process metrics and there are qualitative impact metrics. And the quantitative metrics are things like, how many people visit the site, how many pages get consumed, whatever. The qualitative metrics are, at the broadest level, what legislation changed partially in response to journalism we may have produced. And that's not to say that we advocate. Our role is to report and then let the advocacy and legislative processes go where they will based on our reporting. So I would argue, for example, we've done a lot of this housing work, as you know. There's legislature addressing issues like exclusionary zoning before the legislature. Whether that legislation passes or doesn't pass, the fact that this conversation has occurred, and I would argue largely in response to our reporting and then reporting of others, but I feel like we've framed that issue, that would be a success. We stimulated a conversation about a topic, and then the community, the state gets to make its own decisions about what it wants to do about that topic. Other qualitative kind of metrics are, and they're hard to measure, are, do people change their mind in response to our journalism? Do they forward our journalism to their friends? Does our journalism provoke them into testifying? Does it inspire them to to advocate for a cause or a candidate in some way? All of those things related to the democracy literacy that I talked about at the beginning.
Bruce, this may be, not to jump in, interrupt, but it may be a good point to ask Christine's question, which kind of is related, which is, could you envision the Mirror partnering with an organization like SVP around core issues in the state, issues where our nonprofit partners are working to, make an impact on?
Absolutely. The rub, of course, is how we define partner.
Right.
Our editorial independence is our core value that we will not sacrifice. But, and some of you may have seen, you may have gotten an email from me yesterday announcing a partnership with Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, where we and they share kind of common goals of strengthening community and improving quality of life in Connecticut at a really broad level. They have particular strategies for achieving those goals. We don't we don't cast any judgment as to whether those are the right strategies or the wrong strategies. That's not our job, but we are partnering with them to be kind of a publication platform through a semi-innovative for us at least, program that we're calling branded storytelling. It's essentially what is called sponsored content in other news organizations. But sure, I mean, there's events, there are, sponsorship type things, and there's opinion columns or opinion, how do I say this? There are opinion series, I guess I would say. So we've written some series with Data Haven, for example, where they've written them, we've published them, they've written a series of them, we've created a brand for the series, we provide a little support in social media. So yes, there are ways of partnering, and we'd love to explore that for sure.
That's great. I know we're almost out of time here, so I want to just call on Jim Schaefer. I see you have several questions. Maybe Jim, just ask your top question, and then we'll kind of just do a quick summary.
Sure.
Jim?
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. Just a real quick question is, I assume everybody with power in the state, in particular, the major donors, the billionaires and so forth, your founder, the kitchen table billionaire, for example, they all read every day. You're the first read. And I'm just wondering what value you place on a nonprofit finding the money to advertise, or creative ways to be in your publication, your online publication, as you mentioned, with partnership kind of things. And also, Hearst Media seems to own everything other than Connecticut Mirror. So if you could just comment on that, on Hearst, the impact of them buying up, 90% of all the papers. That would be an interesting insight. Thank you.
Sure. First of all, as they say, from your lips to God's ears sort of thing in terms of state's leading philanthropists reading the Mirror. I know that some do. And, I will say this, I guess at some level, we punch above our weight. In fact, a guy yesterday asked me, we have an employment issue. A guy asked me if we're FMLA eligible or waiver eligible, because he thought we had more than 50 people, and we have 14. We have 14 people. But in any event, a key goal of ours, this I should have answered as one of the challenges, it is to diversify our funding. We are way too dependent on a very limited number of wealthy people, and that poses, any number of issues, some perceptual, and some just a matter of, long-term sustainability. In terms of advertising, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean. Do I see nonprofits advertising with us? Yes, anybody can advertise with us, although we have pretty limited advertising availability. We did last year in the middle of COVID, and this is another way we could partner with you, by the way. We did last year offer an advertising slot that would have a rotation of ads from nonprofits at no cost that we would offer to struggling nonprofits. One proposal we actually recently made to a bank was, you all could buy that slot, and then your philanthropic partners, nonprofits that you support, could advertise in that slot for free, and you would get credit for kind of spot, this brought to you by whatever bank. So if that's what you mean by advertising, or that kind of a flavor, yes, absolutely, we could try to partner around that. It helps those nonprofits, and it helps this nonprofit, which are both important. And then in terms of Hearst's dominance, Hearst is a great partner to us. And I'm not sure, they're certainly dominant in Fairfield County, and then they have a handful of other newspaper properties in other parts of the state. Who knows, I don't know what their if what their expansion plans are or are not. In terms of, I mean, dominance by any one organization is not great, which is why I'm glad that we do have a number of other, at least currently viable news organizations in Connecticut. But as I say, they're a good partner and they carry a lot of our content. And so at some level that diversifies the perspective, I guess, that is appearing in Hearst publications.
Okay. I know we're we're 3 minutes past the hour. I want to thank Bruce for really stimulating conversation about the importance of journalism, the future of journalism in Connecticut, and just share our congratulations to the Mirror for the extraordinary work that you guys are doing. It is the first way I wake up every morning is reading the Mirror, and I encourage others to as well. If you're involved in state issues, it's indispensable. And I want to thank everybody here today for joining us on this Connect and Learn and participating. For those of you who are less familiar with Social Venture Partners, we are ourselves a nonprofit that support other nonprofits through grant making and through our volunteer consulting teams. We're focused on racial equity and economic security through supporting these nonprofits and through some systems change work that we're engaged in at a state level, both on career pathways and workforce development, early childhood education, and race equity. So we encourage everybody to join with us. We're a membership organization. There's no minimum to join. If you're interested, feel free to send Marjorie or me an email or just even put a note in the chat line. We'd love to have you as part of SVP as we continue to grow and try to make Connecticut an even better place. So again, thank you, Bruce. And we're excited to kind of explore partnerships with the Mirror and SVP. And and again, thank you everybody for participating today.
Great, thank you.